The first thing I noticed was the perfume. Not mine, not Lily's, but something heavy and sweet lingering in the fabric of Mark's jacket when I hung it on the hook by the door. I stood there longer than I should have, my hand pressed against the lapel, breathing in that cloying scent I knew didn't belong to our home. I could have dismissed it, but the faint shimmer of lipstick on the inside collar made denial impossible. In that quiet moment, with the hum of the refrigerator in the background and the faint buzz of Lily's music upstairs, I felt the foundations of my marriage shift beneath me. For years, I had trusted Mark's long work trips, his late-night calls, his tired excuses. That evening, the evidence wasn't a suspicion, it was a stain I couldn't wash away. Before I continue, let me know in the comments where you're listening from, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more true family stories of betrayal, justice, and the quiet strength that carries us through. My name is Elena Brooks. I've been a high school counselor for nearly 2 decades, the kind of person who spends her days listening to other people's children sort through their pain, their confusion, their hopes. I married Mark when I was 25, and for a long time, we felt like a steady picture of suburban success. He rose through the ranks of a regional sales company, the kind of man who always had a suit pressed and a story ready, while I built a quiet life grounded in school calendars and community events. Our daughter Lily was the center of that life, a bright and determined 17-year-old who could disarm me with a smile even on the hardest days. We had the house with the porch, the neighbors who waved the photo albums that suggested we were exactly what we seemed, ordinary and content. Mark was ambitious, always pushing towards something bigger. Business dinners, client trips, long weekends at conferences that seemed to multiply as his career grew. I told myself it was the price of stability, that his absence was balanced by the comfort he provided. At gatherings, people admired how polished he looked, how effortlessly he could charm a room, and I would smile proud to be his wife. Tessa, his old college friend turned event planner, often joined us at these dinners. She was quick with a laugh, quick to offer help, the kind of woman who slid seamlessly into our lives. For years, I accepted her presence, even welcomed it, never questioning why she always seemed to know more about Mark's schedule than I did. My own life was simpler, built on routines that rarely made headlines. I woke early to pack lunches, stayed late at school to guide students through essays and broken hearts, came home to a kitchen that always needed wiping, and a daughter who always needed a ride. I wasn't glamorous, and I knew that, but I thought my worth came from steadiness. My father-in-law, Walter, used to tell me I was the anchor of the family. He had built houses his entire life, and when he looked at me, he said, I reminded him of strong foundations, unseen, but essential. It was a compliment I held on to when Mark's world seemed louder and brighter than mine. The trouble is, foundations can crack long before they collapse. I started noticing the little things, though. At first I buried them under reason. Mark's phone angled away on the counter the late-night showers when he came home from trips, the new ties he hadn't mentioned buying. Tessa's texts arrived at odd hours, bubbling with inside jokes that never included me. I told myself not to be paranoid, not to tarnish the life we had built with suspicions I couldn't prove. But the scent on his jacket that night wasn't suspicion. It was proof. Proof that the harmony I had defended for so long was already fractured. I folded the jacket neatly and hung it back on the hook, my hand steady even as my chest felt hollow. Upstairs, I could hear Lily's laughter through her door, her voice spilling out into the hall as she spoke to a friend. That sound tethered me, kept me from falling into panic. Whatever storm was coming, I couldn't let it touch her yet. So I swallowed my questions, smoothed my face, and prepared for dinner as if nothing had changed. But inside, I knew the veneer of our perfect life had cracked, and once a crack shows, it never disappears. It only deepens. And I had the sinking feeling that this was only the beginning. The morning after, I noticed the perfume I moved through the house, as if nothing had shifted, though everything inside me felt unsettled. Mark sat at the kitchen table with his phone in one hand, a half-eaten bagel in the other. He looked up briefly when I set a cup of coffee down for him, then quickly turned back to the screen. I searched his face for something, an apology, a flicker of guilt, or maybe just acknowledgement, but found only the blank look he wore when he wanted to avoid questions. That day at work, I caught myself losing focus during counseling sessions, my mind circling back to the smell clinging to his jacket. I thought of Tessa more than once, remembering how her perfume lingered after hugs, that same thick sweetness that now seemed trapped in my husband's clothing. The idea rooted itself so deeply that by the time I drove home, I wasn't wondering if something had happened. I was wondering how long it had been going on. Mark arrived late that evening. His tie loosened his smile, just a little too practiced. He claimed a client dinner had run over, though I noticed his eyes flicker when I asked which restaurant. He muttered a name I didn't recognize, then brushed past me to hang up his coat. I didn't push, but I caught the faintest trace of that perfume again, as he moved by stronger now than the night before. I stood in the hallway long after he went upstairs, staring at the closed closet door, knowing the truth was hiding in plain sight. A few days later, Tessa called to check on plans for a fundraiser she was organizing. Her voice was light, but something in her tone felt guarded, as though she was choosing each word carefully. She mentioned Mark twice in the span of a minute, both times, in ways that felt rehearsed. "He's been so helpful with the sponsors," she said, followed quickly by, "You must be so proud of him." I answered politely, but when I hung up, I sat in silence at the kitchen table, gripping the phone in both hands. For the first time, I wondered if she was speaking to me as a friend or as someone trying to cover her tracks. At home, the tension grew harder to ignore. Mark picked fights over small things, snapping at Lily for leaving lights on, or scolding me about the grocery bill, as if he were looking for an excuse to stay angry. One night, he accused me of being distant, his voice rising as he demanded why I didn't seem supportive anymore. I stood at the sink, rinsing dishes, my hands trembling under the warm water, and said quietly, "Maybe I don't feel as close to you as I used to." He stormed out of the kitchen without another word, leaving me in the clatter of plates and silence. Lily began to notice. She asked me one evening if Dad was mad at her because he hardly spoke to her anymore unless it was to criticize. I pulled her close and assured her it wasn't her fault, though my chest tightened with guilt. I didn't want her carrying the weight of suspicion that should have been mine alone. Still, I saw her eyes searching mine, looking for an explanation I couldn't yet give. Walter, my father-in-law, stopped by around that time to drop off some tools for Mark. He lingered in the doorway, studying me with the quiet perception of a man who had spent his life reading structures for signs of weakness. "You look tired, Elena," he said, his voice gentle. I forced a smile and blamed long days at school, but he didn't look convinced. He patted my arm before leaving, murmuring that I should take care of myself. His words stayed with me long after he drove away. The more I watched Mark, the clearer the pattern became. Late nights stretched later, phone calls grew shorter, and excuses grew thinner. He had always been good at presenting the polished version of himself to the world, but inside our home, the seams were coming apart. I noticed how quickly he set his phone face down whenever I walked into the room. I noticed how he checked the clock constantly on weekends, as though waiting for something or someone. Each observation was a thread, and together they formed a rope tightening around my throat. The hardest part was pretending not to see. At school, I guided teenagers through heartbreak and confusion, telling them to trust their instincts and honor their feelings. Yet at home, I was swallowing my own instincts every single day. I folded laundry beside a bed that no longer felt shared, cooked dinners for a family that was quietly unraveling, and forced myself to smile across the table while suspicion settled in my chest like stone. One Saturday afternoon, Mark announced he had to meet a client downtown. He kissed me quickly on the cheek, barely making eye contact, and grabbed his keys. I stood by the window after he left, watching his car turn out of the driveway. The uneasy feeling in my stomach told me more than his words ever could. When he returned hours later, the smell of that perfume preceded him into the house. He avoided me entirely, heading straight upstairs, and I knew then that whatever boundaries had once existed had already been crossed. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the steady rhythm of Mark's breathing beside me. The weight of betrayal pressed down, but so did the weight of silence. I had not spoken the words out loud yet, not even to myself, but they echoed in my head just the same. He is lying to me. And worse, he believes I will never confront him. The cracks in our marriage were no longer invisible. They stretched wide enough to feel beneath my feet with every step I took through the house. I began to understand that the life I thought we had was already slipping away, and that soon pretending would no longer be enough. I didn't know what form the truth would take when it finally surfaced, but I sensed it waiting, ready to shatter whatever remained of our fragile peace. And in that quiet, sleepless hour, I realized that the real storm had yet to begin. Nights became the hardest. I would lie awake long after the house settled, staring at the shadows stretching across the ceiling, wondering how many of Mark's late hours were really business and how many belonged to someone else. He slipped into bed, smelling faintly of cologne that wasn't his usual brand-carrying stories that were thin and hurried. He rolled onto his side without a word, while I lay frozen beside him. My breath shallow, my heart heavy. Silence filled the space between us, like a third presence neither of us wanted to name. At school, I found myself going through the motions. Students came into my office in tears over heartbreaks and fractured friendships, and I offered them the same calm advice I had given for years. But even as I spoke, I felt the irony burn inside me. I was guiding them toward honesty and trust while I swallowed my own suspicions at home. By the time the last bell rang each day, I was exhausted from carrying the weight of both their secrets and my own. Small signs of distance began to multiply. Mark's phone was always on silent, tucked face down on the table. He took calls in the garage. His voice lowered until I could barely catch a word. On weekends, he claimed fatigue and disappeared upstairs for long naps, though I often heard the faint hum of his voice behind the door, speaking to someone who was not me. I stopped asking questions, not because I believed him, but because I feared the answers more than the silence. Lily noticed the changes too. One evening, she came into the kitchen while I was chopping vegetables for dinner. She lingered in the doorway, her expression uncertain. "Mom?" she asked softly. "Is Dad mad at you?" I looked up from the cutting board, forcing a smile that didn't reach my eyes. "Why do you ask?" She shrugged, twisting the strap of her backpack. "He doesn't really talk to you anymore. And when he does, it sounds like he's annoyed." I crossed the room and pulled her into a hug, holding her a little longer than usual. "No, honey," I whispered. "It's not you, and it's not your fault." But even as I spoke, I knew she wasn't wrong. Dinner became a performance. We sat at the table, the three of us pretending at normalcy, while the air thickened with tension. Mark criticized the food more than he used to, commenting on too much salt or not enough seasoning. He scrolled through his phone during conversations, nodding absently, while Lily shared her excitement about college applications. I caught the flicker of hurt in her eyes each time he dismissed her words with a distracted grunt, and I bit my tongue until I tasted blood. I wanted to protect her from his distance, but I couldn't protect her from noticing it. The perfume returned again, this time clinging to the seatbelt of Mark's car. I discovered it when I borrowed his keys to pick up groceries after work. As I adjusted the strap across my chest, the scent rose sharp and undeniable, stronger than before. I sat in the parking lot for several minutes, gripping the wheel, staring at the red glow of the dashboard. In that small enclosed space, there was no way to convince myself it was imagined. Someone had been sitting where I was, and it wasn't me. Later that week, I found a receipt tucked into the pocket of his jacket when I went to hang it in the closet. A restaurant bill dated on the same night he told me he was stuck late at the office. The total was high, the type reserved for special occasions, and 2 glasses of wine were listed. My hands shook as I folded the slip of paper back into the pocket, careful to leave it exactly as I had found it. I closed the closet door slowly, my heart pounding so loudly I feared Lily would hear it from the next room. Even Walter began to sense something was wrong. He stopped by one afternoon to drop off a tool Mark had forgotten at his workshop. As he stood on the porch, he glanced toward the empty driveway. "Mark working late again?" he asked. I nodded, forcing steadiness into my voice. "Yes, another meeting." Walter studied me for a long moment. His eyes narrowed with quiet concern. He didn't press further, but before he left, he said quietly, "If you ever need anything, Elena, you know you can call me." His words lingered after the door closed like a lifeline I wasn't ready to take. I grew practiced at hiding the evidence of my pain. I smiled at neighbors-attended school events hosted Lily's friends with trays of snacks and polite chatter. But when the house was quiet, when Lily was asleep and Mark was gone again, I let the mask slip. Tears slid silently down my cheeks as I sat on the couch, staring at the dark television screen. My hands twisted together in my lap, searching for something to hold on to. I tried to pray, tried to breathe, tried to remember who I had been before all of this. The silence became its own kind of answer. It told me what Mark wouldn't say, confirmed what I didn't yet have proof to confront. I knew the woman had a name, though I didn't speak it aloud. Tessa. Her perfume, her lingering looks, her 2 casual mentions of Mark during phone calls. The pieces fit together with painful precision. I couldn't ignore the pattern any longer, but I also couldn't summon the strength to break it open. Not yet. So I endured day after day, moving through the house like a ghost in my own life. I let Mark believe I was blind, let Lily believe I was strong, and let Walter believe I was holding steady. Inside, though, I was breaking quietly each night, carving another crack in the woman I thought I was. The only thing I held on to was the certainty that truth, once uncovered, could never be buried again. And in the deepest hours of the night, I began to sense that a shift was coming, one that would make it impossible for me to remain silent any longer. The night I stopped pretending began quietly. Mark was upstairs, shutting the bedroom door with a firmness that told me he didn't want company. Lily was at a friend's house working on a group project, so the house belonged to me for the evening. I wandered into the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and leaned against the counter in the dim light. My reflection in the dark window stared back tired eyes, pressed lips a woman who had been waiting for proof to arrive. And then it struck me sharp as a bell. I didn't need more proof. I already had it stitched together from perfume, lies, and distance. The realization didn't come with anger, but with an unexpected stillness. For months, I had felt as if I were drifting in a current, powerless to stop it. Now the water was clear. Mark had betrayed me, and Tessa had helped him do it. I couldn't change the past, but I could decide what happened next. That knowledge steadied me like a hand at the small of my back. The next morning, I dressed for school with unusual care. I tied my hair neatly, chose a blouse that made me feel confident, and walked into my office determined to hold myself differently. Students came and went seeking advice, and for the first time in weeks, I felt present with them. I realized that my own silence at home had been draining me more than I knew. By lunch, I had made a promise to myself I would no longer sit quietly and wait for the storm to pass. That evening, Mark sat at the dining table, scrolling through his phone, half listening, as Lily recounted details from her day. I watched him nod absently, offering no real response, and something inside me snapped into focus. When Lily left the table to shower, I set my fork down and looked directly at him. "We need to talk," I said evenly. His head lifted, his eyes wary as if the words themselves were dangerous. About what he asked, though he already knew. I kept my voice calm. About us. About where you've been spending your time. About Tessa. The fork clattered against his plate, his face tightening into practiced indignation. "You're imagining things, Elena. Tessa is just a friend." I folded my hands steady. "Then why do I smell her perfume on your jacket? Why do I find receipts for dinners you never mentioned? Why is Lily asking me if you're mad at me because you hardly speak anymore?" His mouth opened, then closed. For once, he had no script ready. He pushed back from the table, pacing the kitchen with sharp, restless movements. "You're overreacting. You've always been too suspicious. That's why I don't tell you every detail. I know you'll twist it." His words slid over me, but they no longer carried weight. I had spent too many nights letting him dictate the truth. Now I simply watched silent until he faltered under the absence of my defense. Later that night, I sat on the edge of our bed, listening as Mark feigned sleep beside me. My hands rested in my lap, my eyes fixed on the darkened ceiling. I realized that confrontation alone wouldn't protect me. Words could be denied, twisted, forgotten. I needed something stronger. I needed to begin preparing for what might come if this marriage fell apart entirely. The idea felt foreign at first, but as the hours passed, it settled into my bones with quiet certainty. The following weekend, while Mark claimed another work obligation, I went through our files in the home office. Bank statements, credit card bills, insurance policies, all the details of our life laid bare in neat stacks. My heart pounded as I noted the withdrawals, the restaurant charges, the hotel stays, explained away as business trips. I copied everything, sliding the papers back exactly as I found them. Each page was a piece of a puzzle he didn't know I was assembling. Walter stopped by that Sunday afternoon to drop off some leftover lumber for a project Lily was working on at school. He lingered again in the kitchen, watching me with careful eyes. "You seem different," he said gently. I forced a smile, but it didn't hold. For a moment, I considered telling him, laying the truth bare, but instead, I said, "I've just decided I can't keep carrying everything alone." His brow furrowed, but he nodded slowly, respecting the boundary I hadn't spoken aloud. That night, Mark slipped into bed late once again, carrying that faint perfume that no longer needed naming. I turned onto my side, eyes open in the dark, and whispered silently to myself, "No more silence. No more waiting." My heart was still bruised, my body still heavy with grief, but my mind was sharpening. I had finally stopped asking whether he was betraying me. The only question left was how I would respond. And with that, I knew the next chapter of our lives would no longer be dictated by his lies. It would be shaped by the choices I made. Quiet choices, deliberate choices that would change the balance of power between us forever. The weeks that followed carried a strange calm, the kind that feels like air before a thunderstorm. Mark continued his rhythm of late nights and excuses, while I continued mine of silence and observation. I no longer begged for explanations or fought against the walls he built. Instead, I began collecting the pieces he left scattered, careful not to disturb the illusion he still clung to. I told myself that if I couldn't control his choices, I could at least control what came next. The first quiet step was opening a separate bank account. On a chilly Saturday morning, while Mark slept upstairs, I slipped out and drove to a branch across town. The banker, a young man with kind eyes, asked if I wanted the account linked to my husband's name. I shook my head and signed only my own. The pen felt heavier than it should have, but when I left the building with a crisp envelope of documents, I felt the first true breath of independence in months. After that, I began diverting part of my paycheck. Not enough to raise suspicion, just enough to build a cushion. Each transfer was a small defiance, a reminder that I was no longer standing unarmed in the shadows. I kept meticulous notes, storing receipts and records in a folder tucked discreetly behind the cleaning supplies. It was a hiding place I knew Mark would never check, and each time I opened it, the growing stack gave me a quiet reassurance. I also started keeping a journal different from the accounts I had scribbled in grief during sleepless nights. This one was deliberate, neat, written as if for an audience that might someday need to read it. I recorded dates, conversations, inconsistencies, and the subtle ways Mark pushed distance into our home. I stapled receipts beside the entries and made copies of every bill that carried his signature alone. It wasn't a diary, it was a record, and the longer it grew, the less fragile I felt. Lily remained unaware of the full truth, though I could see her watching both of us more closely. One evening, she sat at the kitchen counter while I prepared dinner, her voice careful as she asked Mom, "Do you think Dad's happy?" I kept chopping vegetables, steadying my breath before answering. "I think sometimes people get lost in work and forget what matters," I said softly. She nodded, thoughtful, and didn't press further. I wanted to protect her from the sharp edges of betrayal, at least until I knew how to handle them myself. Mark's behavior made the preparation easier. He grew careless in his cover, perhaps believing I had stopped noticing. One night, he came home with his shirt misbuttoned, a faint smudge of makeup near his collar. I handed him a dish towel under the pretense of drying his hands, watching his face pale when he realized I had seen it. I said nothing, simply returned to stirring the pot on the stove, and his silence stretched louder than any excuse he could have offered. That moment told me everything. He was convinced of my blindness, and that gave me the space to keep building quietly. Walter dropped by more often during that season, sometimes bringing groceries, sometimes just sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee. His presence was a comfort, though he didn't ask questions. One afternoon, he glanced at the neat folder I had left open on the counter, filled with receipts and notes I hadn't yet hidden. He didn't comment, but when his eyes met mine, there was an unspoken understanding. He gave a small nod before rising to leave, and I knew he saw more than he let on. In December, a chance encounter confirmed what I had long suspected. I was leaving a school board meeting downtown when I spotted Mark's car parked outside a restaurant. Through the frosted window, I saw him leaning close across a table, his expression softened in a way I hadn't seen directed at me in years. Opposite him sat Tessa, her hand grazing his as she laughed at something he said. I froze on the sidewalk, my breath clouding in the cold night air, watching long enough to etch the image into memory. I didn't go inside, didn't confront them. I turned and walked back to my car, heart steady, mind sharper than ever. That was the moment I knew my quiet preparations were not only necessary, but urgent. At home, I replayed the scene in my mind while sitting at my desk. I added the date to my journal, noting the time and place, the witnesses I might call if I ever needed them. I wasn't sure yet if I would use it in a courtroom or a conversation, but I knew I would use it. Betrayal had shifted from suspicion to certainty, and certainty is powerful fuel. The days that followed carried me with a new kind of composure. I no longer searched for slips in his story, no longer tested his explanations. I didn't need to. Instead, I planned quietly, the way one prepares for a storm cellar when the sky begins to darken. No one sees the digging, but when the winds arrive, you have a place to stand safely. Mark mistook my calm for surrender. He grew bolder in his absences, less careful in his lies. He thought the silence meant he had won. What he didn't see was the woman across the table quietly shifting the balance, building strength in the shadows. Each receipt, each account statement, each copy of a bill was a brick. And one day, those bricks would form the wall that stopped him cold. I didn't yet know when that moment would come. But as the year turned and the days stretched longer, I felt myself growing steadier. Betrayal had wounded me deeply, but it had also stripped away the last illusions I held. And beneath the pain, something stronger was forming, a resolve I had never felt before. It was only a matter of time before the quiet steps I had taken in secret would lead to something neither Mark nor Tessa could escape. And when that moment arrived, I would be ready. The night the confrontation came, I felt it in the air before it happened. Mark had been gone since early morning, his text messages clipped and delayed, his excuses growing thinner each time. When he finally walked through the door after 9, he carried himself with the swagger of a man rehearsing lines. Lily was upstairs studying, her desk lamp glowing under her door, while the downstairs felt staged for whatever scene he was about to perform. He set his briefcase on the counter, poured himself a drink without asking if I wanted one, and leaned against the kitchen island. His eyes lingered on me longer than usual, searching for weakness, or maybe waiting for me to break the silence first. When I didn't, he exhaled sharply. "We need to talk," he said, as though he were the one who had been wronged. I dried my hands on a towel and met his gaze. "About what?" My voice was even practiced after weeks of steady restraint. His shoulders squared, his jaw tightening. "About this distance. About the way you've been watching me like I'm guilty of something. I'm tired of feeling like a criminal in my own house." I held his stare, letting the weight of his words settle between us. "A criminal is someone who hides what he's done. And that Mark is exactly what you've been doing." His face paled, the flush of anger creeping quickly up his neck. "You're out of line," he snapped, slamming the glass onto the counter. "You've always been paranoid, Elena, twisting everything into a story that fits your suspicions." I walked past him, calmly opened the drawer where I kept the journal, and laid it flat on the counter between us. His eyes dropped to the thick pages, each one neatly dated, stapled with receipts recorded in my even handwriting. "This isn't paranoia," I said quietly. "This is evidence." His hand hovered above the book, then drew back, as though the pages burned. "You've been spying on me," he hissed, "documenting like some investigator. Do you even hear yourself? That's obsessive. That's sick." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't have to. "You've been lying to me, Mark. Lying to Lily. Lying to everyone who thought you were the man you pretended to be. I don't need to make a story fit. You've already written it yourself." The silence that followed was thicker than any argument we'd had before. He rubbed a hand over his face, pacing in short, sharp bursts across the kitchen tile. "So what now? You going to parade this around? Tell the whole neighborhood?" "I'm a cheater. Destroy my career. Embarrass me in front of Lily." His words carried the edge of panic, the bluster of a man who realized the ground beneath him was shifting. I closed the journal gently and slid it back into the drawer. "I don't have to destroy you, Mark. You're doing that yourself. I'm just not going to protect you anymore." His eyes narrowed, and for the first time I saw fear behind the anger. He stormed past me up the stairs, the slam of the bedroom door rattling the frame. When the house grew still again, I sat at the table with my hands folded in my lap. My heart was pounding, but it wasn't fear this time. It was clarity. The confrontation I had avoided for so long had finally arrived, and I had stood through it without flinching. The next day, he tried a different tactic. At breakfast, he was uncharacteristically gentle, asking about my schedule, complimenting Lily on her grades. But I could see the strain in his eyes, the way his hand trembled as he buttered his toast. He was calculating buying time, trying to find a way to regain control. I answered politely, never once letting him glimpse the resolve that had settled into me like stone. That evening, while he sat scrolling through his phone, I overheard him in the den, whispering into it. His voice was sharp, almost frantic. He spoke Tessa's name more than once, his words clipped with blame. She knows something. She's keeping records. We have to be careful. I stood quietly in the hallway, each syllable confirming what I already knew. When he noticed me a moment later, he dropped the call, his smile brittle as he asked if I needed anything from the store. I shook my head, holding his gaze just long enough for him to look away. Walter stopped by later that week, and Mark disappeared upstairs as soon as he saw his father's truck pull into the driveway. Walter sat with me at the kitchen table, his hands folded, his voice low. "He's making a mess of himself," he said simply. "I can see it, Elena. I don't know all of it, but I know enough." I swallowed against the lump in my throat. "I'm not going to fight with him anymore," I said. "I'm just going to let the truth stand where it is." Walter gave a slow nod, his eyes heavy with sorrow, but also with quiet approval. That night, I lay in bed, listening to the steady rhythm of Mark's breathing beside me. It sounded rehearsed, too, even to be real sleep. I turned onto my side, my eyes open in the dark, and thought about the pages of my journal, the accounts I had opened, the quiet steps I had already taken. For months, I had carried pain in silence, but now silence had become something else entirely. It had become power. And as I drifted into an uneasy rest, I knew that the cracks in Mark's carefully built facade were no longer cracks. They were fractures spreading fast, and soon they would split his world open for everyone to see. The unraveling began slowly, then all at once. Mark's temper flared, more often his excuses grew thinner, and his confidence slipped like a mask cracking under pressure. He came home one evening flushed and restless, slamming doors louder than necessary, pacing the kitchen as though searching for control he no longer held. Lily had already gone to her room, and I sat quietly at the table watching him circle like a man cornered by his own lies. He tried to bait me into argument, throwing out accusations of neglect, but I met each one with silence until his voice fell flat against the weight of my calm. A few days later, whispers started finding their way to me. A colleague at school mentioned seeing Mark downtown, his arm brushing too close to Tessa's as they left a restaurant together. She hesitated before speaking, unsure if I already knew, but I simply nodded and thanked her. Word had already begun to spread the very thing Mark had feared most. What he thought he could contain between the walls of our home was slipping into public view beyond his control. At home, his attempts to cover himself grew desperate. He staged sudden bursts of affection, buying flowers, suggesting family dinners, speaking louder than necessary, at gatherings, as if rehearsing for an invisible audience. But the effort rang hollow. Even Lily sensed the shift. One night, she asked him why he spent so much time with Miss Tessa, her voice sharp with the suspicion only a daughter can carry. Mark laughed too loudly, dismissing her with a wave of his hand, but the look in Lily's eyes told me she wasn't convinced. The breaking point came during a family gathering at Walter's house. Mark arrived late with Tessa close behind under the pretense of helping with arrangements. Conversation at the table grew strained, and when Walter raised a toast to family, his eyes lingered on me longer than anyone else. The silence that followed his words was heavier than the clinking of glasses. Mark shifted uncomfortably, his hand tightening around the stem of his wine glass, while Tessa smiled too brightly, her laugh a beat too forced. I sat still, my palms resting on the tablecloth, waiting. It was Walter who finally pierced the silence. His voice carried the weight of years spent building and breaking things with his hands. "Mark," he said evenly, "your mother would have told you that a man who dishonors his home dishonors himself first." The words landed with quiet force, and for the first time, Mark had no retort. Tessa's smile faltered, her cheeks coloring, as the room grew still. Lily glanced between us, her eyes wide, understanding more than I had wanted her to. Mark stood abruptly, muttering something about needing air, and left the room. Tessa followed her heels, clicking against the tile, leaving behind an emptiness louder than any outburst. Conversation resumed in fragments, but the tension remained hanging heavy in the corners of the room. Walter reached across the table, covering my hand with his expression saying what words did not. In that moment, I realized the truth was no longer mine to carry alone. Others had seen enough, and the story Mark tried so hard to control had slipped from his grasp. In the days that followed, his unraveling accelerated. At work, his colleagues began to notice his distracted state, his missed meetings, his unsteady temper. A neighbor stopped me at the mailbox, lowering her voice to mention seeing Tessa's car parked in our driveway when Mark claimed he was traveling. I listened quietly, nodding, knowing that the evidence was building around him without me lifting a finger. At home, he grew frantic, rifling through drawers, questioning me about bills and papers as though searching for proof of his own undoing. He accused me of plotting against him, his words edged with fear. But I met his rage with the same steady composure. "I don't need to plot, Mark," I said one evening as he loomed in the doorway. "The truth speaks for itself." He left the room without a word, his footsteps heavy on the stairs. Each day I felt the balance shifting further. Where once I had carried the weight of doubt in silence, now it was he who bore the strain of exposure. The world he built on lies was collapsing, not with a single strike, but with the steady erosion of trust from every direction. By the time his closest friend avoided him at a neighborhood gathering, offering only a curt nod before walking away, I knew the verdict had already been written. And as I stood in the kitchen one quiet evening, watching him retreat again into the shadows of his own making, I realized the end was no longer something to fear. It was inevitable, and it was near. Walter's words had carried through the family gathering like a quiet gavel, and from that moment forward, nothing was the same. Mark withdrew further, no longer able to cover himself with charm or excuses. His colleagues turned distant neighbors, grew cautious, and even Tessa stopped appearing at his side. The world he had built on image and secrecy collapsed faster than either of us could have imagined, leaving only silence and consequence in its place. At home, his presence became rare. He began spending nights elsewhere, avoiding Lily's questions and my gaze. Eventually, the decision was no longer mine to make. He left for good, moving into a small apartment on the other side of town. Papers were signed without a fight, because by then, even he knew the damage was beyond repair. I kept the journal locked away in a drawer, never needing to open it again. The truth had done its work without a courtroom. Lily watched it all unfold with more strength than I expected from a 17-year-old. She saw the betrayal for what it was, but she also saw the quiet steadiness I tried to hold on to. One evening, she told me, "Mom, you never yelled, and you never begged. You just stood." Those words stayed with me. I wanted her to know that dignity isn't weakness, that calm persistence can outlast any storm. Walter remained a steady presence. He came by often, checking on Lily's car, repairing the loose board on the porch, sharing coffee in the kitchen. He never spoke unkindly of his son, but his eyes carried both disappointment and sorrow. When he clasped my hand one afternoon and said, "You've handled this with more grace than I've ever seen," I felt something in me release. I realized I didn't need vindication shouted in public. Quiet recognition from those who mattered was enough. In the months that followed, I found myself rediscovering pieces of life I had let slip away. I spent more time with Lily planning college visits, walking in the evenings when the air cooled, and even joining a book club at the library. The absence of constant suspicion lifted a weight from my shoulders I hadn't realized I carried. Slowly, I began to breathe again. Looking back, the betrayal itself will never vanish. It marked me too deeply for that. But it also gave me something I hadn't known I possessed. It taught me the value of patience, of silence used not for surrender, but for strength. It showed me that standing firm, even in the face of lies and humiliation, can dismantle someone else's deception more powerfully than anger ever could. Justice didn't arrive in a single dramatic moment. It came in fragments, in neighbors turning away from whispered rumors, in colleagues losing respect for the man who had once been admired, in a daughter who learned that truth always outlasts falsehood. And perhaps most of all, it came in my own reflection when I realized I had not been broken by what happened, I had been remade. Now when I sit on the porch in the evenings, I think about the storm we survived. Lily by my side, Walter stopping in with his quiet strength, and the house carrying laughter again instead of suspicion. There's peace in knowing that betrayal does not have the final word. Dignity does. Before we close, I'd love to know what part of this journey spoke most to you. Share your thoughts if you'd like, and if these stories of family betrayal and quiet strength resonate with you, I hope you'll stay connected here